The most dangerous moment in a public figure's life is not the scandal itself. It's the silence right before it breaks. Because when the phones stop ringing, when statements are delayed, when questions go unanswered, that's when people start asking the questions no PR team control. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And right now, one name is sitting uncomfortably at the center of those questions: Meghan Markle. Not on a red carpet, not at a charity gala, not behind a carefully scripted podium, but inside a story that, according to reports and watchdog chatter, is no longer about image. It's about scrutiny. Here's the question no one wants to say out loud. What happens when a foundation built on compassion, justice, and transparency suddenly finds itself linked to an IRS inquiry? Because if the reports are true, this isn't just another headline. It's not another online rumor. It's not another tabloid cycle that blows over by Monday. This is the kind of situation that doesn't fade quietly. It escalates. And what makes this moment so unsettling isn't just the investigation itself, it's the timing. For years, Archewell was presented as something different. A fresh start, a mission-driven organization meant to do good after the Sussexes stepped away from royal life. It wasn't supposed to be messy, it wasn't supposed to raise eyebrows, and it definitely wasn't supposed to draw attention from federal authorities. Yet here we are. According to multiple reports circulating in watchdog circles and financial transparency discussions, Archewell's filings, spending patterns, and operational structure have attracted questions. Not accusations. Not charges, questions. But anyone who understands how these things work knows one uncomfortable truth. The IRS does not ask questions for fun. They don't browse headlines. They don't care about celebrity status. And they don't move unless something triggers their interest. So what triggered it? That's the part no one has answered yet. Supporters insist this is nothing more than routine scrutiny, the kind any nonprofit can face. And that may be true. Many organizations go through reviews and come out untouched. But critics point to something else: delayed filings, sparse public reporting, big promises with limited visible outcomes. Again, none of that is proof of wrongdoing. But it is fuel. And in the world of public trust, fuel is dangerous. Because this story isn't unfolding in a vacuum. Public patience with celebrity charities is wearing thin. Donors are asking harder questions. Audiences are no longer satisfied with inspirational language alone. They want receipts. They want clarity. And when clarity doesn't come, suspicion fills the gap. Sources close to the situation describe a sharp contrast between Archewell's public messaging and its internal stress levels. Late nights, emergency calls, a sudden shift from forward-looking projects to defensive positioning. And yes, emotion. Reports suggest Meghan herself has been deeply affected by the situation. Overwhelmed, frustrated, and according to some accounts, in tears over what this could mean for her reputation, her family, and her future. Think about that for a moment. This is someone who has spent years carefully constructing a narrative of resilience, empowerment, and moral authority. Someone who understands the power of optics better than most. So ask yourself, if everything was perfectly fine, if this was truly nothing, why the silence? Why the delays? Why the sudden tightening of communication? This is where the story gets uncomfortable, not because of what we know, but because of what we don't. No charges have been announced, no conclusions have been reached, no outcomes have been decided. But investigations don't need verdicts to cause damage. They create doubt, and doubt is ruthless. Because once the public starts questioning a charity's integrity, the damage doesn't wait for legal outcomes. It happens in real time. Donations pause, partnerships hesitate, supporters second guess, and reputations crack under the pressure. What makes this moment especially volatile is how fast the narrative can flip. 1 week, it's a misunderstanding. The next, it's a headline. Then it's a deep dive. Then it's a reckoning. And according to insiders, there may be one specific detail, one document, one filing, one unexplained discrepancy that shifted this situation from quiet concern to serious attention. We don't know what it is yet. But the people watching this closely seem convinced of one thing. This story is only at the beginning, because what comes next isn't about public statements or emotional appeals, it's about paperwork. And paperwork has a way of telling stories no one can spin. But the rise of Archewell didn't begin with suspicion. It began with hope. And to understand how things reached this point, you have to go back to the moment everything looked perfect. It started in applause. Applause from fans who believed this was finally the moment when celebrity, privilege, and purpose would align into something meaningful. When the Sussexes walked away from royal life, many expected bitterness, lawsuits, maybe even silence. Instead, they got a brand, a foundation, a promise. Archewell was introduced not just as a charity, but as a statement, a redefinition, a clean slate wrapped in words like compassion, service, and impact. It wasn't supposed to look like the institutions Meghan and Harry had left behind. It was supposed to feel modern, human, ethical, different. And for a while, it worked. Headlines were warm. Coverage was generous. The messaging was emotionally sophisticated, carefully curated language about lifting voices, supporting communities, and driving change. Archewell wasn't selling projects, it was selling values. And people bought it. But here's the first uncomfortable question. What exactly was Archewell doing? Not in theory, not in intention, in practice. Because when you strip away the speeches and mission statements, a charity's real story lives somewhere else. In filings, in timelines, in numbers. Early supporters assumed Archewell was moving quietly, strategically, behind the scenes. That impact doesn't always show up immediately. That building a foundation takes time. And that's true, to a point. But watchdog groups and nonprofit analysts began noticing something odd, not dramatic. Not illegal, just unusual. The organization's public footprint was small compared to its global visibility. The announcements were big. The measurable outcomes were harder to find. Again, that doesn't mean wrongdoing. But it does invite curiosity. Think of it like this. If a restaurant opens with celebrity owners, a beautiful brand and a massive grand opening, but months later, no one can quite describe the food, people start asking questions. Not because they hate the owners, but because something doesn't add up. Critics pointed to delayed filings and limited transparency in early reporting periods. Supporters countered that Archewell was still young, still evolving, still finding its footing. Both things could be true. But in the nonprofit world, perception matters almost as much as performance, because charities don't run on profit. They run on trust. And trust is fragile. What made Archewell especially vulnerable to scrutiny was its positioning. This wasn't a quiet local nonprofit. This was a globally visible organization attached to one of the most polarizing public figures in the world. That visibility cuts both ways. It attracts attention. And it attracts examination. Every decision feels magnified. Every delay feels intentional. Every vague answer feels suspicious, even when it isn't. And here's where the contradictions start to emerge. On one hand, Archewell emphasized humility, service, and stepping away from spectacle. On the other, it remained deeply embedded in media cycles, streaming deals, and public narratives. So people began asking, quietly at first, then louder. Is Archewell a charity that uses celebrity to amplify impact? Or is it a celebrity brand using charity to amplify itself? That question alone doesn't accuse anyone of anything. But it reframes the entire conversation. Because when motivations are questioned, scrutiny follows. And scrutiny doesn't care how good the intentions were. As Archewell grew, so did the expectations. Donors, partners, and observers wanted clarity. Not slogans, not vision statements. Details. Where is the money going? How is impact measured? Who oversees compliance? These are boring questions. But boring questions are the most dangerous ones, because they're the ones regulators care about. Behind the scenes, according to people familiar with nonprofit operations, even small inconsistencies can trigger attention, not because something is wrong, but because something is unclear. And unclear is enough. It's important to pause here and say this clearly. None of this proves fraud. None of this proves misconduct. None of this proves criminal intent, but it does establish something critical. A foundation built on moral authority has less margin for error than any other kind, and Archewell's margin was razor thin. Because once skepticism takes root, it doesn't stay polite, it spreads. Online forums began dissecting filings, commentators started comparing promises to outcomes. Even neutral observers began to wonder why Archewell seemed more present in headlines than in detailed reporting. And then, quietly, the tone shifted. Not publicly, internally. According to reports, this was the moment when Archewell stopped looking outward and started looking inward, when lawyers became more involved, when communications tightened, when every sentence was reviewed twice, Because when oversight becomes possible, preparation becomes urgent, and that's when whispers began to circulate. Not about tabloids, not about haters, but about federal attention. Because in the nonprofit world, there's one sign that changes everything. When questions stop coming from critics and start coming from regulators, and if the rise of Archewell was built on hope and belief, and pressure when it reaches a certain point forces truths into the open, but the most unsettling part? According to those watching closely, the real shift didn't come from public criticism. It came from a paper trail. And once that trail caught attention, there was no turning back. There's a saying among compliance experts that goes like this: most charities fail loudly, but investigations begin quietly. No press release, no warning shot, no dramatic knock on the door, just questions. And if the reports circulating among watchdog observers are accurate, those questions began landing on Archewell's doorstep when almost no one was paying attention. Here's the part that unsettles people who understand how the system works. The IRS doesn't start with accusations. It starts with curiosity, a form that doesn't quite match a timeline that feels off, an explanation that raises more questions than it answers. And once curiosity turns into review, the process becomes relentless. Sources familiar with nonprofit oversight say this is where many organizations panic, not because they're guilty, but because they realize how exposed they are. Every email, every transaction, every internal decision suddenly matters. And when the organization is attached to a global figure like Meghan Markle, the stakes multiply overnight. Because this isn't just about compliance, it's about credibility. According to reports and discussions among nonprofit analysts, the focus of attention wasn't one dramatic act, but patterns. How money moved, how decisions were documented, how the foundation's public mission aligned, or didn't, with its reported activities. Again, this does not mean wrongdoing, but it does mean scrutiny. And scrutiny has a psychological effect that no press strategy can fully control. People close to the situation describe a shift in tone. Meetings that once focused on growth reportedly pivoted toward risk. Language became cautious. Statements were pared down. Silence replaced confidence. Because when regulators are involved, even innocent mistakes feel dangerous. Imagine building an organization designed to project moral leadership, then realizing every detail of that organization is now being examined through a legal lens. That pressure is not abstract, it's personal. Reports suggest Meghan experienced this phase not as a public controversy, but as a private crisis. Frustration. Anxiety. The weight of knowing that reputation doesn't wait for outcomes. Ask yourself this: if you believed your work was pure, your intentions clean, and your structure sound, how would you react to an investigation? Calm reassurance, or fear that something, somewhere, might be misunderstood? That's the tension at the heart of this story. Supporters argue this is exactly how the system is supposed to work. Oversight exists to protect public trust. Reviews happen, questions get answered. Life moves on. Critics counter with something sharper. They point out that the most damaging investigations aren't the ones that end in penalties, they're the ones that end in doubt, because the public doesn't read filings. They read headlines, and the moment IRS appears next to a charity's name, the narrative changes, even if nothing else does. Inside nonprofit circles, there's another uncomfortable truth. Once an organization becomes high profile, it loses the benefit of ambiguity. What might be overlooked in a small charity becomes magnified in a celebrity foundation. Every delay looks intentional. Every complexity looks suspicious. Every explanation feels defensive. And Archewell, by design, was never small. It was born famous. That fame, once an asset, now became a liability. According to those watching the situation, the most stressful aspect wasn't any single question. It was the realization that there could be many more. That one inquiry often leads to another. That answers generate follow-ups. And follow-ups generate paper trails. This is where insiders say the emotional toll became visible. Late nights, urgent consultations, a constant awareness that control over the narrative was slipping. Because investigations don't operate on feelings or intentions. They operate on records. And records don't care about optics. What makes this chapter especially volatile is what hasn't happened yet. No official conclusions. No public findings. No definitive statements clearing or condemning anyone. Just waiting. And waiting is brutal, because in the absence of answers, speculation rushes in. Was this routine? Was it triggered by a complaint? Was it something internal that raised alarms? No one outside the process knows, but according to multiple observers, there is one looming possibility that could redefine everything. Not legal consequences, but disclosure. Because if certain documents, explanations, or internal communications become public, the story could shift instantly, not from allegation to guilt, but from ambiguity to clarity. And clarity, depending on what it reveals, can be devastating. This is why people close to the situation reportedly describe this period as the most difficult so far. Not because of punishment, but because of exposure. Because once scrutiny begins, it doesn't stop at finances. It spreads to intent, to judgment, to credibility. And when credibility cracks, no statement can fully repair it. The question now isn't whether Archewell survives this moment. It's whether the image built around